chat with you a little bit. I am really excited to be here, and I want this to be a conversation back and forth. Maybe not quite as casual as our sports talk beforehand, but feel free to ask me questions. I'll try to give you useful answers. You all have a great thing going here. Let me start out by saying that. This is an old school publication. This is what I like to read. It's got pages, you can hold it up. It's got pictures, even better. But you all probably already know this, but there's a great article in the Gulf Shore Business, the October edition, about the Rocket Lounge. This is such an outstanding feature for Lee County and Fort Myers and all of Southwest Florida to help attract business, to bring business, to expand business, to give folks, like you, a chance to get to bring an idea into fruition, make it happen. It's exciting. It's really neat. And so what I want to do is have you all take away from this some basic ideas about how to protect yourself from lawsuits and how to put yourself in the best position to deal with a potential lawsuit, because unfortunately, it's sort of like protecting yourself from the common cold. There's only so much you can do, and sometimes you catch a cold. So then how do you battle back against the cold? How do you put yourself in the best position to defeat the cold, have the cold for the shortest time? And so that's kind of where we need to start our thinking in terms of how do you protect yourself from a lawsuit. So why, and then here's the interactive part. So these are not rhetorical questions. So Chris, why are you here today?
To get some more ideas, expand my knowledge of how to protect yourself from being sued.
Right.
I've been sued in various contexts, or my family's been sued. So
Okay, so you want.
So I've understood from different perspectives. I've also sued people reluctantly.
I understand.
When you're left with no other option.
Right.
And so any ideas that I can get are always useful ideas to prevent it or be successful if you prevail.
Okay, we'll talk about all of that. Dale, how about you?
Well, when I read the initial topic, how not to get sued as a startup, I was like, well, that's very interesting for me. I just relaunched my consulting practice as of 4 months ago. But then as I sit down here and actually see the screen behind you, I didn't even read it until literally just a second, and it was very pertinent because as Mark and I were speaking earlier, it spoke to exactly what I've done in a previous role as far as vendor management goes. So I'm anxious to learn if there were things that I could have done better, or if things that I can extract that maybe were best practices and I didn't even know it at the time, and then utilize those for potential future clients as well.
Good. And one thing that I hope that both of you and everyone that's watching takes out of this is, the idea behind this is to save, time, energy, and money, right? The idea is, why do you want to? That's the sound of money going down a drain. You can find so much on the internet. So, why would you want to put your hard-earned down? Why would you want to put your precious time into a situation when there is no exit strategy for you or protective strategy for you to move forward? And so to illustrate that, I like to do some fun stuff. They say that when you put words on PowerPoint, it's bad, so we're not going to do that. So we've got, does anyone ever remember the movie Chevy Chase, Vacation, came out in the early 80s?
Sure.
All right, so let me just set this little clip up. So as you recall, Chevy Chase is taking his family to Wally World in the family truckster. There's a problem when they get to near the Grand Canyon, and he has to deal with let's just call him service provider. Let's take a look here.
Okay. So, never heard of you driving off that road. You must have got manure for your brain. Yeah, well, I'm out of town. So, what's the bill?
What's the bill, right? You don't want to ask that question.
How much you got? Oh, I'm asking how much you got. I'm asking you how much you got. There you want it. Look, I don't have time to play around with things, so how much is it? All looking for? You're sure?
he gets threatened with a wrench, bad work, and he's cleaned out. I don't want that to happen to you guys, and so that's a humorous illustration. One more illustration. I love movies. You know, my wife and I watch a number of movies a week, and I write little reviews about them, and then I kind of take lessons from them. So let's take a look at this one. This is a film from the early 90s. This is called Pacific Heights. You have two folks that were a husband and wife, and they had a house that they were going to have to rent underneath their house in San Francisco. And they did not do their homework. And they ended up with, whoops, went the wrong way, sorry. They did not do their homework, and they ended up with a bad guy. There we go. We'll just watch this real quick, and then we'll move on.
Carter Hayes has come to San Francisco. He will search for the perfect apartment.
He's doing his homework.
He will find the perfect landlords. And now, the game begins.
I'm tenant. Carter Hayes.
Melanie Griffith, Matthew Modine, and Michael Keaton.
Mr. Hayes? Mr. Hayes?
Pacific Heights.
Right. So I don't want Michael Keaton showing up at your doorstep, you know, after you've hired him and there's a problem and you've got this sinking feeling. So how do we deal with that?
Plus he's Batman, you know,
Plus
that's the other thing.
he's Batman, that's right. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do, and I think you were talking about this earlier, Dale, is you gotta figure out what are you trying to do? You know, when you are considering hiring someone or you're considering entering into some sort of arrangement, it doesn't mean you have to be hiring them. When you're entering into some sort of interaction between your business and someone else that's gonna provide something for your business, you know, what is it exactly that you're trying to have that person or other company do? You need to capture that before you go out and hire. Because you need to then identify the right person to provide the service that you are looking to have done. Okay, so the words here are my guy. Do you really need to hire out? Is there someone else that's in your business right now that can handle that issue? Think about it. If you've hired someone, you've already vetted them. One of the things, Chris, that you were talking about before was the vetting process. Now, you were talking about it in terms of the investment that you will make and that potentially other investors will make. But the vetting process is not limited to that, of course. It's limited. It expands to everything that, you know, comes through our guilds, right? So I want to vet whoever is going to work for me, whoever's going to be in my building, whoever's going to gain my trust. If I've already hired someone, they've gone through my vetting process, I probably feel pretty good about them. I know that they have a certain skill set. If they've got that skill set to handle this other need that I have, why go outside? Now, you, of course, there may have to be some arrangements about hours and compensation and, you know, duties that someone else would take care of. But, you know, I always would want to look inside first if you've got a competent person inside of your startup or your established company. The bottom line is don't go outside if you don't have to. Now, there are plenty of good reasons to go outside. New ideas, new energy, different skill set. But if all of those things are not necessarily relevant and you can tackle it with what you've got, I think that's something that you need to think about very seriously. So you've identified what it is you're trying to do, right? That was our first thing. Then we try to figure out, is it something that we can do inside? Then we got to find, I'm sure everyone, well, probably no one in this room remembers Harry Truman, but I'm sure folks remember studying him at some point along in their schooling. So he was a blunt spoken president in the late 40s and early 50s. And he had this saying, the buck stops here, because he got tired of, I think that's from cards, where you would pass a buck if you didn't want to make a decision. Well, he said, you know, someone's got to make the decision. So in your organization, you need to identify the person who's going to be the point person, the contact person, the buck stopper, that's going to deal with the contract provider that you hire. This makes sense for a lot of reasons. One, it's gonna cut down on expense, particularly if you're talking about dealing with someone like a lawyer that charges by the hour, right? You don't wanna have multiple points of contact, because then you start to have multiple communications that this person's gonna have to deal with and they'll charge you for. So money is always important. Then, perhaps more important is mixed messages. You don't wanna have mixed or conflicting signals going to the person that you hire. You wanna have one person that's speaking for the company when you deal with whomever you hire. So find out who's gonna be your point of contact. Next, very important, and this is all part of establishing some basic financial controls for your companies. What's your budget? What do you intend to, what is it that we've already talked about what is it you're trying to do. So presumably you've already identified a budget for that. If not, then this will be the bucket of cold water in the face. How much are you planning to spend on this gentleman or this lady that you're gonna hire, or this company that you're gonna hire to outsource something or provide some input to your company that you can't provide with existing resources? We need to identify that. Why is that important? You have a lot of C-suite experience. Why do you think that would be important, Dale?
Well, I can't imagine ever committing to any amount before you know what the scope of the work is going to involve and the potential impact to my budget.
Right. Because your budget is your life, right?
Yeah, budget is king.
Because if you have something that eats up budget, then that means you gotta chop other stuff out of the budget. That other stuff could be muscle or bone.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so.
Very little fat in most of my budgets.
Exactly. I mean, most people who have been involved in business for a period of time know what's important and what's not. It's not like you just got, fleets of Cadillacs out there for, people to drive around in. So you want to establish your budget for what you're trying to do, and then for the personnel that you may be contracting with. Then we come back to vetting, right? We talked about that. Don't vet someone if you don't have to. If you can hire someone from within, do that. So we've made the decision to go outside. We've got a budget established, so we've got some financial controls, and we have some predictability. That's the other great thing about budgets, is they give you predictability, and that's what outside investors like, right? Most outside investors, I'm guessing, would like this to be a passive investment. They want to sit there and wait for checks to come in. They don't want to. Some people want to get in and get involved, drive it around a little bit themselves, but for the most part, they're looking, and as our startups are looking for passive investment. So the great thing about the budget, and then we'll come back to screening, the great thing about the budget, that provides that predictability, that consistency that folks that want to be passive investors would like to see in a company. I mean, that is, when you think about business, you look for something that's consistent, predictable. When I'm a lawyer giving advice to a business client, they always want to know, well, what's going to happen. I would like to know what's going to happen. It doesn't help to know what happened as much. It's better to know what's going to happen. So that's another reason the budgets are important. Coming back to screening, so we need to identify some names. Don't go crazy. I don't feel like there's a magic number. There should be more than 2 or 3, but I'd say less than 10. And then you want to find someone that can personally recommend the company or the professional or the contractor you're going to use. I'm sure that you can think of times in your life when you went to, no one uses the phone book anymore, went to the yellow pages. Now people go to the internet, and you don't usually use the first name you find. You look for some sort of qualification. Does this person have the licensing that's required? Does this person have accreditation from agencies whom I respect? Does this person have qualification merit awards? As good as that is, you still, as a human being, I still feel like if my neighbor that I live next to has put up a roof on his house, and I see, and he tells me, it's never leaked, I'm probably going to value his opinion quite a bit. Same thing. I mean, don't necessarily go to your neighbor. I mean, unless your neighbor is in the field that you're trying to hire from, but go to someone that you trust, It can be, an association of like-minded professionals. But talk to folks that have had the same problem, figure out how they conquered it, figure out people that they used. That's how I would build my list, and that's how I do build my list, when I have to hire out.
Although, question for you on that.
Yes, sir.
Is, so oftentimes from a professional perspective, I often don't know if a contractor is coming in, who their other customers are, and oftentimes they could even be competitors of mine, which I may or may not have a relationship with. So oftentimes I have to ask the vendor, well, can you give me some references that I can call independently? But not in that example, not dissimilar from Jane Doe who's applying for a position at your
Sure.
firm, and you say, oh, I have to have 3 professional references on you, Jane. And, well, who's she gonna give you? She's not gonna give you the last company that she worked for where she was fired because she was late to work consistently.
Right.
So any reference ability that an individual or a vendor is going to give you, unless they're an idiot, they're going to give you somebody who they trust is going to give them a good reference. So how else, besides that, other than using some of the quote-unquote internet lists, the Angie's list of the world, which is great if you're having something done to your house.
Right.
But if I'm dealing with a professional vendor that's not ranked on an Angie's list,
Right.
what other methods could I use to confirm that referenceability?
Well, I would take, you can kind of turn it on its head. You get some names, right? And maybe you don't have the ability to sort of pre-screen them through your, professional acquaintances and colleagues that you trust. So you get names the old-fashioned way, not looking through the yellow pages, but going on the internet, still building that list of names, and then you throw them at your professional colleagues. Hey, have you heard of this person? Anything good or bad? So you turn it around and use them as sort of as a post-screening, if you will.
Okay.
I would do that. And then another way that we do things, well, these are obvious, right? The search engine. Go on court websites. You can go and you can find out if they've sued or been sued. Now, of course, there's no shame in suing or being sued. But you can sort of get is it just a contract dispute, or is there a claim that someone was untruthful, or there's different kinds of lawsuits and different kind of things. And in any case, once you find out about that, you can do more digging. This will lead to more digging. If it's someone that holds a license like a contractor or a doctor or lawyers, many of Florida's professions are regulated by the Department of Business and Professional Regulations. Lawyers are regulated by the Florida Bar, so you won't find their credentials there, but you would find them on the Florida Bar's website. But most of the professionals that have to be licensed by the state of Florida, you can find their license and their complaint history and their other qualifications through this website.
When you say court website, what's an example of some of the court
Well, like
websites?
in Lee, you can put into Google, Lee County Clerk of Court.
Okay.
And you can then, there's a search tool on the Clerk of Court's website, and allows you to put in, names. So you can put in the first and last name of the person that you propose to hire.
Okay.
You can do that for most every county in Florida now.
Okay.
Miami-Dade.
And the federal courts.
And thank you, Mark, yeah, exactly, the federal court system. There's it's called PACER, P-A-C-E-R, and you just put PACER login into Google, and you can go ahead and there's usually a charge, so we're already signed up, my office is, but I think that a private person could go in there and do some searching after, entering a subscriber, becoming a subscriber. These are not very burdensome on the person who's searching. It will take some time to do it, but it's not going to cost you a fortune.
Okay.
So once we've got our initial round of names built, and we've screened them as best we can through professional colleagues or an association, we've gone through what we feel is due diligence, then we want to interview them. Ideally, you'd be able to interview them in person. Doesn't always happen. We don't live in Mayberry, so sometimes you have to, phone, Skype. But there's something, again, I think in human nature, you want to know a little bit more about someone before just hiring them without talking to them. And so ideally, again, you're gonna provide them with exactly what you're trying to hire them to do. Now, you have to be careful if there's some, trade secret or confidential information, you're gonna have to take appropriate steps to protect you when you disclose the information to this person, or you would have to describe it in some general enough terms that you're not compromising your information. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, non-disclosure agreements and things like that. But ideally, you will have the person have an understanding of what it is that you propose to hire them to do or contract out to do. An example would be, if you're hiring them to build an addition to your building, nothing secret about that. Have them come out to your building, walk around the site, get dirt on their shoes, ask them questions, how long will this take? How many people do you need to have on site? What's it gonna do to my access? What happens if we have inclement, weather? What happens, what do you do in hurricane season? At the end of all of this, of course, you're gonna ask them to give you something in writing. If they don't give you something in writing, I would think very hard about what it is that they propose to do in your relationship with them. And so you do that with everyone. Then you go, and then you have a follow-up. Again, ideally, I think in person, but certainly by phone or Skype or, whatever the circumstances permit and your comfort level is. Go back to, this is where we met, this is what we discussed, this is what we intend to hire, or, potentially hire you to do. You gave me a written bid, I have some follow-up questions, and then give them a deadline. That's important for them and for you. Them because, it shows that you mean business, is important for you because it keeps the project rolling forward. Whoever your point person is, in addition to having a budget, the budget forms a control, but there's gotta be a project timeline. If it's not moving along, then, it's wasting. It's wasting money, it's wasting time, and you're not getting to where you need to go. I mean, the point of hiring someone is to help you get the ball across the goal line, to speak in football terms. If you're not moving the ball toward the other team's end zone, then what are you doing? Questions? So far, so good? All of this, I think, is probably familiar to both of you, I'm guessing. Okay. So now we're very close. As soon as the symphony's done playing, we'll kind of go through how to bring it home. Well, this must be the extended remix. Okay, there we go. So not just pictures, but also sound. So so once you've satisfied yourself, this is someone that I can not only fall in love with, so to speak, as a contract provider. This is someone that I can live with and I trust and is going to get the job done for me. Then we got to memorialize it, which is the lawyer's way of saying you got to have a written agreement, right? These are obviously basics, date and sign, you got to keep a copy of it. But the agreement is going to have, Dale was talking at the very outset before we even, started having our back and forth here about scope of work. I mean, that's so critical to have the scope of work. I mean, that is the contract. That's the meat of the contract. What are they going to do? What are you going to do in return for what they do? It's got to be clearly defined, and you don't need to, it doesn't have to. You need to have someone that can help you put that together, whether, again, you have someone in-house or you have experience on your own, or you have a lawyer that you can trust that you've used before. The expense that you will end up paying to have this properly documented is going to be far less than the risk of not having it properly documented if something goes wrong. So you want to have in your agreement, probably depending on the nature of the work that's done, you're going to have a non-disclosure agreement, which means that the person that's doing the work cannot talk about certain things. And you may also need to have a non-compete agreement, which means the person that is doing the work is not going to be able to go into business against you for a certain time period in a certain geographic area. And that's where you really want to have an attorney help you with that. Florida has a very specific statute on agreements in restraint of trade. That's the legislature's way of referring to a non-compete agreement. Don't get it off the internet. I've seen what happens when you get something off the internet, and the money that you think you're saving will be spent very rapidly in trying to make a bad situation workable using a document that's just grabbed off the internet from someplace or that's homemade. So those are things that you really need to have good advice on. And that's it. I mean, then we go back to the idea of the point person is regularly monitoring, following up, assisting with the completion of the project. Peter.
So I always have this nightmare of all these very, very long agreements and go through them and then, understand them and then find the loopholes in them and all those things.
Yes.
So, is that possible to have a relatively short agreement and still a relatively tight agreement, really meaning that it protects you enough? Or if it protects you enough, it has to be very long?
That's such a good question. I mean, I think that you can get good protection in a short. I mean, that's short and long are relative terms.
Yeah.
I mean, I always equate the seriousness, if you will, of a contract document with the seriousness of the project. I mean, if you have a $40 million project, you're going to put a lot of time into your contract rights that you used to try to protect it. If this is a $10,000 project, you don't need to be that complicated.
But that's really the point. Complication and complexity not necessarily need to be the same. So just because something is complex doesn't need to be necessarily complicated. So complex things may be put into a relatively simple contract, but still providing protection, or that's just not possible. Well, and also a kind of an attached question to that one. Would you put everything into one contract, or maybe the non-disclosure, non-compete would be one, and then some of the scope of the work on another one, and so on and so forth. So maybe as you break them up, it's easier to digest them, or you would just put everything into one contract. Well, what's the better?
I don't know the answer to that, because I've seen it both ways. I would probably at that point I'd say, look, Mark, I've got this client who's ready to go. He's got some serious questions about how do we structure this? Are we going to have 3 agreements? Are we going to have 1? I like having one document that has everything in it. That's not always possible or practicable. And having litigated these, it almost doesn't matter. What matters more is what's in the document, when was it signed, how long is it valid, and you can have all of that in one document. You can have it in 3 documents. They're all signed the same date, but I don't know that matters so much as long as it covers everything.
Breaking it up, it's more from my viewpoint, meaning the client's viewpoint, because for me, it's maybe probably easier to digest. If I see a 40, 50 page document,
right,
immediately it's like, how long it's going to take for me to get through. If I see, 3 or 4 of these 5 to 10 page max documents, maybe it's a little bit easier for me to get through.
And I think that's a great question to work through if you have an attorney and you say, look, this is not a $40 million project. It's an important project to us, but I don't want it to be, when we memorialize it, I don't want it to be so complicated and so complex that my point guy who is not negotiating it can understand it and deal with interpreting it and keep my contractor on the line. So it's got to be, simple enough to be understood, but complex enough to cover everything. And so that's what you have to work through.
Okay.
Yeah, Dale.
I think my practical example that I talked about earlier might be also helpful in answering Peter's question, is that and you mentioned a good point, which is, depends on the size of the deal, but it also depends on the volume of business over time that you may be doing with that particular vendor. I've been pretty successful with the philosophy, and I always describe it like a tree, basically. The root of your tree is always that NDA. I mean, the seed that's going in the ground is the NDA. From that blossoms a consulting agreement or a master services agreement, and that really has the bulk of your language in it that will cover you no matter what happens with the contract. And that does take a little bit more time, because that is your thicker document. That's, you know, the old college kid who says, well, based on the weight of this agreement, this feels like an A. And I'm sure lawyers do the same thing.
Yeah.
This feels like about a $10,000 contract.
You have a scale in your eye?
Yeah. And then, once you have the MSA in place, then to hang SOWs, statements of work or scope, off of that MSA become much more manageable for the individual, whether it's a client or the vendor, because then it really is a 3 to 5 page document that has a scope of work, basic terms and conditions about that scope of work, and then if, God forbid, anything goes wrong with, and I often use construction examples, so
Sure.
you're building a house,
Yeah.
and you have an SOW for the guy who's doing the driveway, the carpenter, the roofer, the landscaper. So if anything goes wrong with any one of those, they've all signed the same MSA, which is the cover, the master document. But if something goes wrong, I don't have the roofer and the landscaper all having to go to court because the landscaper screwed up.
Right,
So all I'm worried about is his SOW.
right,
And in IT, you know, it's the same difference. If I'm building a data center, I'm outsourcing one portion. The guy who's providing the hardware versus the guy who's running the cabling and the fiber, two different scopes of work covered by the same master agreement.
right.
I've always found personal success in doing it that way, but there are, as you said, and maybe this is a one-off vendor, it's a $10,000 piece of work. All I need is that I still need the NDA. I'm never going to do without the NDA, but I can get away with just an NDA and an SOW that has all those other conditions in there, maybe dumbed down to,
Right.
to a simpler format.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it certainly will depend on the nature of the job. As you said, is it a one-off? Is it something where there'll be serial or continuing work? But the points that you raise are so important that you would definitely want to speak to your lawyer or your contractor after and say, hey, look, you know, these are things I'm concerned about. You know, I don't want a phone book, or I don't want a contract that looks like the, you know, Miami-Dade County phone book. You know, things that you should, we're almost done here, but just a couple of parting thoughts that I want to leave you all. Things that you want to look for in a contract, you know, that you'd be dealing with outside providers. You know, you want to have an integration or a merger clause, which basically says everything that we already discussed is disregarded, and everything that we're agreeing on is within the four corners of this document. And we'll probably say it in a little bigger words and more convoluted lawyerly phrases, but that's basically what it means. Is everything we discussed beforehand doesn't matter. Whatever we agree on is what's the typewritten word in this document. So that's called a merger or integration clause. You'd want to, you know, make sure that that document or that paragraph or something like that is in there. You would probably also want to have a prevailing party attorney's fee clause. That way, if something goes wrong and you need to hire an attorney to enforce your contract rights, then if you prevail, and hopefully you will, you would then be able to use that as leverage in negotiations and ultimately potentially get a judgment for attorney's fees and costs if you're trouble of having to enforce the contract. So that's something you would want. You would also probably want to have a venue and jurisdiction clause, which would say, you know, where is this going to be fought out? Would it be, you know, when you rent a car, you know, if you have a dispute, sometimes you got to go to Seattle. Well, you know, I'm in Fort Myers. I guess I'll just, you know, pay this. I'm not going to go to Seattle, hire a lawyer there. So you will want to have your contract say, you know, that the venue and jurisdiction would be, you know, the courts of competent jurisdiction in Lee County, Florida. So we talked about prevailing party. We talked about a merger clause. We talked about a venue and jurisdiction clause. You'd probably also want to look for a no oral modification clause. Basically, it's going to say that the only way that this agreement is amended is if it's signed by all of the parties here too. there are exceptions to that, and we're not gonna get into that because it's not supposed to be a contract law class, but the best protection is to have that in there and then make sure that it's followed. If you're gonna change the agreement, don't just say, well, we're gonna start doing it this way from now on and not document it as required. You've gotta follow the contract. That's your rule book now. And if you deviate from the rule book, it's held against you. You know, you may say in the contract that we're not gonna have any oral modifications, but if you do start modifying it orally and both parties start acting out on the oral modification, then that language that says we can only modify it by writing won't count. And so you need to make sure, as I said, follow it because it's your rule book. I think that you'll have great success if you follow, I mean, these are very kind of basic and general principles. I didn't want to get very specific, other than, you know, I've given you some kind of keys to take away and look for in contracts. But I hope that you find that these things will help you out as you're getting your project off the ground. You know, identify exactly what you want to do, you know, define that scope of work, figure out, can I satisfy it from inside my office? If not, then we go ahead and we screen candidates, run them through the search engines, run them through the license websites, you know, talk to professionals in your field that may have had the same problem, you know, do the personal interviews, have them come walk around the site, come into your building, see what they need to install, or then come back, get that written bid from them, and make sure that they understand exactly this, what you want them to do, and then get it memorialized, and then happy success. I think things will work. And if they don't work out, then you're in the best position to protect yourself. Again, as we talked about, it's like a cold. You can do your best to minimize the risk of that, but sometimes you may have to deal with
The real estate route, maybe someone who's not that interested in getting into all these details. They'll actually come, they'll do a good job based on references you know, and you've seen their work. And
Sure.
you start mentioning this, their eyes are gonna glaze over, and they're gonna be the best value at the best price. You can get this from someone, I can guarantee you it, but, you know, for instance, on Marco Island, that might cost you a fortune. To get someone who's gonna sit down and iron all this stuff with you, so.
And that goes.
It's gotta be to the volume
Yep.
and scope of
Yes.
future work.
Yeah,
you know.
absolutely, absolutely. And that's where you have to use your judgment as a business person, you know. Is this the sort of project where you know, I've done my homework and I feel I can trust this person, am I willing to risk it? And, you know, as big boys and big girls, you know, we know when we can take risks. Sometimes, most of the time we're right, sometimes we might be wrong. I mean, I'm like the cobbler's kids, sometimes they don't have the best shoes. I have definitely got into agreements without having a perfect written contract, but I've done my homework in advance and I figured, okay, this is a risk that I can take. I can live with this risk. If you don't evaluate, then it's not risk, it's just reckless. All right.